As I reflected on the gospel this week, I was fascinated with a detail in the story that I hadn't really noticed before. In such a long, seemingly random interlude that falls between when Jesus sends the disciples out to share the good news, and after warning them that they will be rejected, and when he welcomes them home in next week's gospel. That single sentence, that detail that jumped out at me, can get lost. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. What a curious statement. John has been persistently calling out the sin of Herod and his wife Herodias, whom he stole from his brother. And Herodias wants him put to death, but Herod liked to listen to him. Why would that be? In 12-step programs, we often hear the phrase, "We are only as sick as our secrets." Those in recovery come to realize how much time we have spent hiding the truth, putting on the best possible face, always trying to look as though we have everything under control, so as to not allow anyone to see how much of a mess we really are. The harder we try, the worse things get, until finally it all falls apart. It inevitably ends, as we say, in insanity, incarceration, or death, or recovery. And a core part of recovery is the process of inviting God in, facing the truth, both the ugly and the beautiful, and sharing it with trusted others. This, we are taught, is how healing can begin. Honest sharing with trusted companions, truth, God. Herod, it seems, knows this, at least to an extent. John tells the truth, and Herod is attracted to, or perhaps even obsessed by this, as much as he is confused. Who talks this way? Who tells truth like this so baldly, especially after they've been arrested for doing so? And yet Herod can't turn away. There is a level on which Herod seems to want what John is offering, and he protects John, protects the truth for a time. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. When forced to choose between the truth he is fascinated with and the careful face he has put on for his friends and neighbors, however, Herod chooses to save face. The truth, as Debbie Thomas suggests in her blog this week, sometimes cuts in order to heal. There's a reason, after all, that we so often avoid the uglier truths in our lives. Acknowledging them hurts. In the last month, an ugly truth in the history of our country and Canada has been uncovered. The graves of over 1,500 Indigenous children who died after they were taken from their families and forced to attend boarding schools, many of them run by the church in order to assimilate and civilize them, have been revealed. Hidden under the noble goals of education, prosperity, and health was a consistent and horrifying truth of torn families, untreated illnesses, emotional trauma of being forced to abandon language and culture, abuse of all kinds. This directly led to the deaths of over 1,500 children who have been discovered in graves at just 7 of the hundreds of boarding schools that existed in the US and Canada. Many thousands more survived the schools, and they and their families still live with that trauma today. The truth hurts. As I have followed this news, I recalled visiting Tower, Sudan, Minnesota, a northern mining community where my grandmother grew up. She worked in her father's store and told many stories about trading and doing business with the native people who lived in the area. And even in her 80s, she still remembered some of the language they taught her some 60 years before. What she didn't tell us was that there was a boarding school for the children of the Boise Fort people of the Ojibwe in her tiny town. Vermilion Lake Indian School was opened the same year that my grandmother was born, 1899, and records show that children attended the school with the goal of assimilating them into European culture until it was finally closed in 1952. My grandmother never talked about this, likely because it was just a part of life in Tower Sudan as she knew it. So often, this is how truths, the inconvenient and horrifying ones, are hidden. A friend and colleague, Bonnie, who is Anishinaabe, shares that her mother always claimed she didn't remember a word of their native language after being stripped of her culture in a boarding school as a child. She never talked about it, but she lived with the trauma. And still today, Bonnie's family is reconnecting with relatives they didn't know existed because of the forced exile and separation they went through as a family. Not long before Bonnie's mother died, a Native man who knew Anishinaabe spent time with her. And for the first time since she was a child, she spoke and prayed in her native tongue. The healing that has come from learning their story and finding their people has been profound, if painful. There's a reason why we so often avoid these ugly truths. It hurts. After Herod watches his stepdaughter, the dancing girl sent by her mother Herodias to seduce Herod away from a truth that terrified her, he finds himself unable to stand by the truth. In spite of his reluctance to do so, he orders John put to death. Herodias is delighted, and perhaps Herod himself felt some relief along with the regret, thinking that this particular truth, at least, would never be revealed. As so often happens in the Gospels, it's not that simple. Looking again at today's text, notice that the whole story of Herod and Herodias and the dancing daughter and John is actually a flashback to events that took place not in the middle of Jesus' public life, but just before his ministry began. In Mark, John's death is presented as the catalyst for Jesus' return from the desert and the beginning of his ministry of preaching, teaching, and healing. And Herod, having put John to death in an attempt to murder truth and save face, sees Jesus, hears of him, and has one thought. John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. The truth is not dead after all, but very much alive. John died for speaking the truth, but the truth did not die with him. Amos, in our first reading today, is sent to tell truth to the Israelites, and Amaziah tries to send him away to Judah, but Amos refuses to go, claiming that he is no prophet, but a herdsman whom God has sent to speak truth to Israel. Queen Esther, a Jewish woman who hid her identity for her own safety, speaks truth to the king very cautiously and very cleverly, knowing she is putting her life at risk. And by doing so, she saves the lives of her people. Jesus warns the disciples that the truth they share will not be well received by all. And Jesus himself died for the sake of the gospel. But in the resurrection, the truth of God's mercy, justice, and grace is still very much alive. The truth hurts sometimes, but the truth in God is what heals. Our Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, speaking about the initiative to investigate all of the federal Indian boarding schools, said, "The Interior Department will address the intergenerational impact of Indian boarding schools to shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past, no matter how hard it will be. I know that this process will be long and difficult. I know that this process will be painful. It won't undo the heartbreak and the loss we feel, but only by acknowledging the past can we work toward a future that we're all proud of." God's truth prevails, and as is revealed throughout Scripture, all healing, joy, and life starts there. I learned the hard way as we wandered lost on a family trip in unfamiliar territory that a map is no help at all if you don't know where you are to begin with. God over and over provides us with that truth, what Amos calls the plumb line, that helps us to level and ground ourselves for the work ahead. The gospel of truth, mercy, justice, and healing of our God will never fail. And whatever truths we face in our own lives or as a people, the disciples traveling 2 by 2 to share the good news remind us that we are not alone. Thanks be to God.